Okay, good afternoon, dear friends from the Philippine and foreign media. For today's press briefing, we'll be accommodating 10 questions, 5 from the Philippine media and another 5 questions from the international media. So for the first question, let's hear it from Ms. Maricel Halili of TV5.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. Sir,
Good
just a
afternoon.
clarification. During the bilateral meeting between the President Duterte and U.S. President Donald Trump, did they raise the issue about the human rights violations in the country?
No, that issue was not raised. However, the president explained in length his war against drug. President Trump seemed to be appreciative of his efforts. There was no comment on the war against drugs. There were like clarifications on the number of drug dealers that have been apprehended since the war on drug was started, and there were also clarifications on whether or not the Philippines has a similar drug menace as Central America, to which the president responded, in some areas of the Philippines, it is as bad as some areas in Central America.
Because President Duterte has been very vocal that he doesn't want President Trump to raise the issue on human rights. So why did President Duterte bring up the issue?
No, my understanding is he explained at length his Philippine domestic policy on the war against drug. And from the body language of the US president, he seemed to be in agreement, and he made the assurance that President Duterte has a friend in the person of President Trump, that he has been an ally since he was elected into office.
Sir, how about the issue on North Korea? Was it discussed during the bilateral meeting?
Not in the bilateral between the US president and the Philippine president. But other than the war against drug, President Trump raised the issue of trade, and the Philippine side expressed their hope that an FTA, or free trade agreement, can also be concluded between the Philippines and the United States, with Philippine authorities saying that if they could have FTAs with countries that were not allies of the US during the Second World War and henceforth, then there should be every reason for the United States to conclude an FTA with the Philippines, which has always been an ally of the United States.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next question for Mr. Raymond Tinaza of Bombo Radio.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary.
Yes.
Sir, this is another relevant issue of the region, and you mentioned they talk about trade. So, relatedly, did the two presidents discuss about the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, which is very vital in the passage of trade within the region?
It wasn't discussed in the bilateral. However, it was brought up in the ASEAN-US dialogue, and specifically, ASEAN reiterated that it would want a peaceful solution to the West Philippine Sea issue, that they would want a code of conduct to be concluded at the latest. And of course, in the ASEAN-US dialogue, North Korea was also discussed. They want to de-escalate the tension, and they want all parties to resort to diplomatic talks and negotiations as a means of resolving the conflict.
Sir, last point. The President Duterte yesterday mentioned that he wants the South China Sea issue untouched. What does he mean? That this would be his position as the President of the Republic or as Chairman of the ASEAN?
The party who brought up the West Philippines or the South China Sea issue was the Prime Minister of Malaysia, because the Prime Minister of Malaysia was asked to deliver the common statement of ASEAN in the presence of the US President.
Thank you, sir.
Third question from Ms. Lianesca Panti of Manila Times.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I would just like to ask about the the plight of the Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar. I understand it was discussed during the ASEAN Summit plenary session this morning, based on the statements you sent to the Malacanang press corps. And I would also like to know if the ASEAN-US summit also touched on the plight of the Rohingya.
Well, I can confirm that the Rohingya people's plight was discussed in the plenary. It was specifically brought up by two member states, and Myanmar specifically addressed the Rohingya issues. Myanmar specifically said, number one, that they are in the process of attending to the Kofi Annan report, that they welcome humanitarian assistance, and that the process of repatriation for IDPs will conclude within 3 weeks after signing of a memorandum of agreement or understanding with Bangladesh. There were no further details mentioned by Myanmar.
Sir, I would like to know the countries who raised the Rohingya issue.
I don't want to make a mistake here, but it was raised, I believe, by, I might make a mistake, I'm sorry, but it was raised by at least 2 or 3 countries.
Okay, so still, sir, on the Rohingya, is ASEAN extending humanitarian aid to the Rohingya Muslims? And what specific aid are you looking at?
Myanmar agreed that they welcome humanitarian assistance, but there was no specific mention of which country will provide what. It was just a general statement that they welcome humanitarian assistance. Now, the Philippine president also said that there was need for humanitarian assistance in Marawi and also in that part of the world.
So, sir, among the ASEAN member countries, there was no offer yet of aid for the Rohingya?
There was, in fact, just a statement that they have received some humanitarian assistance and would welcome further, but there was no specific country mentioned.
Okay, sir, last po. About ASEAN was swift in issuing statements about condemning terrorism in the region, especially after the Marawi crisis. So, but as when it comes to this Rohingya issue, the ASEAN is yet to issue an explicit statement about what is happening there. So, what is keeping the regional bloc from making a comment or making a stand involving the lives of the Rohingya when it is willing to condemn the terrorism perpetuated by ISIS-linked groups?
First,
Because both instances involve lives of people. So I'm thinking, are the lives of the Rohingya Muslims less worthy of ASEAN's attention or firm stance?
let me make a clarification. ASEAN has not issued any statements as of yet. They have only conducted a plenary, and they're in the process now of conducting dialogues with their partners. No? So there will be a time when ASEAN will issue statements towards the end of this summit, and I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not there will be anything mentioned about Rohingya. I just mentioned that it was discussed in the plenary, but it was in the context already of existing UN Security Council resolutions on the Rohingya problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Next question will come from Mr. Joseph Morong of GMA7.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. I'd like to go back to the meeting, the bilateral meeting with the President and US President Donald Trump. How would you describe the rapport between the two? First, that first question first.
I would say it was very good. Let me make the very important confirmation that President Trump did ask President Duterte to sing. It was apparently noticed by US President Trump that the President was humming when Pilita Corrales sang Ikaw, and he encouraged the Philippine President to sing, take the microphone and sing, which the President did. No? The relationship appears to be very warm and very friendly. They've been very candid in their dealings, and it's very apparent that both of them have a person who they consider as not their best friend. They have similar feelings towards former US President Barack Obama.
All right, so do you think that this will mark a turning point in the Philippines' relationship with the United States, given that the president in October last year said he announced the separation from the United States? And if this kind of interaction between Trump and Duterte will translate into policies for the government?
I don't know if I'm revealing too much with this information, but you see the Philippine president reiterated that the Philippine-US alliance has always been very strong and very important. He did acknowledge that there were sour points in the relationship, and the sour points were statements made by the former US President Obama on the administration of President Duterte. Now, I think President Trump addressed this by reassuring the Philippine president that he has always been an ally of the Philippine president since he was elected into office.
Right,
so I would say that there will be a marked difference between the relationship between the administration of President Trump and President Duterte.
On the South China Sea, only if expressed in any of the avenues, either in the bilateral or the ASEAN-US dialogue, what is America's position with regard to militarization in the South China Sea?
Well, as of the time that I left, I was not able to finish the bilateral. I only heard the Malaysian Prime Minister mention the South China Sea issue and the need for peaceful resolution of the same. There was also an appeal for demilitarization and for China to finally conclude the Code of Conduct.
And the U.S. response, wala namang opinion?
There was no response. The only response I got from President Trump was a need for fair trade. And he emphasized that there will hence be reciprocity. If a country will subject U.S. export product to 200% tariff, expect the United States to slap goods from that country also with a 200% tariff.
All right, sir. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Last question from the Philippine media from Ms. Ruth Cabal of CNN Philippines. May we request only 2 follow-up questions as we are also pressed for time. Thank you.
Sir, going back to the issue of the South China Sea, President Duterte said that when he met with President Xi in the APEC summit that Mr. Xi was actually surprised with this very strong statement on the need for a code of conduct in the South China Sea. But yesterday, President Duterte said that the issue should be left untouched. So what message does Mr. Duterte really want to convey with regards to this issue?
Well, I could reveal that there was a frank and very candid discussion on the West Philippine Sea. The president asked China about its intentions, and the president, though, clarified that he was compelled to do so because the Philippines has chairmanship of ASEAN, no? And he wanted to address the apprehensions of many nations, particularly regarding right of navigation in the Indo-Pacific region, no? And the Chinese president reiterated that after their Congress, they have specified goals for China, and these goals will not be met without peace in the region. No? So the Chinese side reiterated that it is against the use of force, that they will not resort to prohibited use of force, and that they are pursuing bilateral relations with every single claimant country. And with the Chinese president reiterating that their relationship with each of the claimant country could not be better, no, today. No? The Chinese president also said that the relationship with ASEAN is at its best, and credit was given by the Chinese president to the leadership of President Duterte.
So it shouldn't be interpreted as a shift in stance, sort of a softening, and also does it have anything to do with the recent high-level meeting, Coast Guard diplomacy between the Coast Guards of the Philippines and China also?
Well, I would say that the Philippines has not changed its course of maintaining very good and cordial relationship with its Asian neighbors without severing ties with the United States. I reiterate that in today's bilateral with the US president, both countries affirmed their very strong and very close alliance.
But in terms of China and the South China Sea issue, the Coast Guard diplomacy between the Philippines and the Chinese Coast Guards.
I think that's pursuant to a commitment made that they will further enhance the relationship and that they will resort to negotiation rather than the use of force.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now may we hear another question from Ms. Atahualpa Ameris Fernandez of Agencia EFE. Mr. Sorry,
Hello,
thank you.
good afternoon, Mr. Roque. I'm going back again to the meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Duterte. According to the White House, they also raised the issue of ISIS. Can you provide some details about that conversation?
Okay, the Philippine president recognized also the contribution of the United States in providing communication assistance during the Marawi conflict, and the Philippine president had occasion to thank American authorities for their assistance. No? They further, the Philippine side made it clear that amongst their priorities is dealing with terrorism and violent extremism. That is the lingo now, terrorism and violent extremism. No? And of course, it was a common interest identified by Philippine and US authorities, the fight against terrorism and violent extremism.
Okay, I don't want to be insistent, but you already answered this question, but Mrs. Sarah Sanders, which is the press secretary of the White House, said that the human rights briefly came up in the context of the Philippine fights against illegal drugs in the meeting. So do you think that's a mistake? Are you totally sure that they didn't address that issue?
Well, there was no mention of human rights. There was no mention of extralegal killings. There was only a rather lengthy discussion about the Philippine war on drugs with President Duterte doing most of the explaining.
Okay, and out of that meeting, which information do you have about the draft of ASEAN about the South China Sea?
Well, we have only concluded the framework for the Code of Conduct. And it is the hope of all ASEAN countries that the Code of Conduct can be concluded at the soonest time possible.
Thank you.
Okay. Last question from Ms. Cecil Morelia of AFP.
Actually, we could take 3 more questions, no? Because we committed to accept 5 questions from the international media.
Mr. Secretary, by not raising the issue of the drug war killings with our president, do you consider that as an endorsement by the U.S. president of our president's war on drugs?
Well, perhaps you should address this to U.S. authorities. No? What I can confirm is the U.S. president did not comment on the war against drug. There were instances when he was nodding his head as the Philippine president was explaining his war on drugs, but I leave that for American authorities to comment.
Body language?
Well, many times he was nodding as the president was explaining the war on drugs, specifically on the ill effects of drugs, complaining that the special rapporteur on extralegal killings even brought to the Philippines a so-called American expert to say that drugs is not dangerous to human health. No? And the president, of course, produced again a publication of the UN where the UN specifically pointed out to the ill effects of the different forms of drugs, including shabu. Of course, we've had to, the Philippine president has had to explain to the US president that shabu is the same as meth in the United States.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next question from Spanish agency, Mr. Gaspar Luis Canela. Is he here? Okay, let's proceed to, okay.
Yeah, sir. Hello. Good afternoon. Well, I would like to, if you could comment a little bit deeper about this draft about South China Sea. Apparently, the ASEAN group is, they are afraid that the situation is not very stable now in terms of security. Why are they afraid? Is because of the militarization in the area by China, or?
Well, I can confirm that in the bilateral between the Chinese president and the Philippine president, the issue of militarizing the South China Sea was brought up. China responded by assuring that they are not ready to go to war with anyone. And the Philippine president also clarified that it is not to the Philippine interest to resort to the use of force as well. No? China assured the Philippine president that they will not resort to the use of military force and that they will not block freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Now, I do not know if it is true that ASEAN fears militarization, and that is why they want a code of conduct to be adopted. They're just trying to avoid mistaken responses to actions. That's why they want to achieve some sort of predictability by adopting the code of conduct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have from, check, hello? Miss Dana Batnag of GG Press.
Hi, sir. I'd like to ask about the U.S.-ASEAN meeting. How did President Trump explain his policy towards Asia? Because there are fears that the Obama administration's pivot to Asia could have changed.
No, in fact, it was all trade from President Trump, beginning with the bilateral in the Philippines. After the president's lengthy explanation on the war on drugs, it was President Trump that brought up the issue of trade. Specifically, he brought up the issue of very high tariffs imposed on Philippine cars into the Philippines. No? And likewise, in the ASEAN-US dialogue, the US president, reiterating his stand in APEC, no, advocated for fair trade. No? That it is high time, according to him, that the United States will practice reciprocity. They will treat countries as they treat the United States. Now, all these statements seem to indicate that the United States still considers ASEAN as a very important trading region.
Aside from trade, did he mention other issues such as regional security and North Korea?
Well, he did not comment. He was made to comment on the common statement of ASEAN that raised the issue of North Korea and South China Sea, but there was no comment forthcoming from the US president as of the time I left, no? And as of the time that the US president responded to the common statement of ASEAN.
Okay, so last question. I just want to clarify, do you get the sense that the focus of US now when it comes to Asia is about trade?
That seems to be very apparent.
Thank you, sir.
In both the bilateral and in the dialogue, the United States was emphatic on the need to promote fair trade.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Last to ask is Ms. Jonna Gilagon of Asahi Shimbun.
Good afternoon, sir. Over the past several months, there seems to be a reinvention in the part of China from somebody who builds artificial islands to somebody who is very eager to help the Philippines with trade, with its fight against terrorism and violent extremism. And this image seems to have also translated to how ASEAN relates to China. It seems to be that Beijing is more of a very cooperative partner. Would you agree that this change is due to the fact that the Philippines has changed its demeanor?
Well, I leave it to you to conclude if we have changed our demeanor. But I think one factor that has brought closer relationship not only amongst ASEAN nations but between ASEAN and its partner countries is the problem of terrorism and violent extremism. No? I think not Basilan, but Marawi. I think Marawi is proof that the problem of terrorism transcends national boundaries, and that is the reason why countries in the region appear to be willing to cooperate even further, no? Knowing that the next flashpoint of conflict could just be anywhere in Southeast Asia and in the rest of Asia.
But in the part of the South China Sea, sir, the Philippines used to be very wary of China, and now we're very close. And we used to be pushing ASEAN to take a stand and protect the region's claims over the South China Sea. So would you agree that the Philippines' own attitude changed and somehow affected ASEAN's attitude as well?
That's probably a safe conclusion, that because the Philippines opted for friendlier relations with China, the Chinese side reciprocated, no? And is now appearing to be more friendly with the Philippines as well. No? Having said that, in the bilateral with the Chinese president also said that relations with Vietnam is also at its best, noting in the past that they appeared to be the parties to be in most conflict with each other. No? But there was an assurance that ties with Vietnam, China and Vietnam have also become warm, and the Chinese president specified that in addition, its relationships, particularly with other claimant countries, Malaysia is at its strongest, and the same thing was said with Chinese relations with Indonesia and Brunei.
On another
Last
topic,
follow-up
sir.
question, please.
Yes, just one more. The Malaysian foreign minister yesterday said that they are open to proposing the deployment of a humanitarian assistance team, or maybe an IMT similar to what they have in Mindanao. Well, the deployment of one IMT to the Rakhine state. Would the Philippines support that proposal?
I have no information on that. As I said, we don't know if ASEAN will have officially a statement on the Rohingya people, but what I did hear was the need for the Rohingya problem to be resolved pursuant to existing UN Security Council resolutions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our friends from the local and foreign media, and of course, our presidential spokesperson, Secretary Harry Roque. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you.